Welcome to Gorehounds, where you and me are going to check out the kills and gore in Beyond Re-animator. Set 13 years after the events of Bride, can the final film in this beloved series live up to the bloody reanimation antics, or re-antics, set down by its predecessors? Let's get gory. The movie kicks off with two kids camping out in a yard. Thankfully, it's not the adventures of young Herbert West, because with acting like this,
what could possibly happen?
We'd have been in for a rough fucking ride. Something is creeping around outside and babysitter Emily is relieved when she sees her brother Howard, and they start playing a game. A game that makes me slightly uncomfortable. But shit, the Prowler is actually a reanimated dead who's hungry for a kill. Don't you think that reanimated dead looked a little bit like Dr. Tong from the movie Day of the Dead? Maybe it's his brother, Professor Tong. Young Howard, distraught at his sister's murder, wanders around outside, and we find out that, of course, West is to blame. Nice one, West. The movie flashes forward 13 years, and it's a hard knock life for West. But not even prison can keep a good scientist down, and we see that West is working on a mysterious new experiment. Elsewhere in the prison, we're introduced to the rest of the main cast. There's Brando, the super sleazy prison warden, a new Dr. Dan, who's called Howard instead, and reporter Laura, who takes the crown for hottest female in a Re-animator movie. Sorry, Barbara Crampton. So you may have noticed that as far as continuity goes, Beyond throws most of Bride's ending in the trash. The main issue being, how did West escape the collapse of the crypt? I can understand though why they didn't want to open that whole box of bats, because it raises other questions like what happened to Dr. Hill batshit crazy, a totally inconspicuous flying talking head. But it would have been nice to have a sentence or two in the script to give us some basic idea of how events went down. Whether or not Dan pulled West out of the rubble is key information on the state of their relationship. Maybe Dan still cared just enough to help West out of the crypt, something that we'll never likely know. There's also the loose end of Dr. Graves that's never addressed. I mean, this guy saw and even used the reagent himself, so God knows what he's doing now. Back in the prison, Dr. Howard's skills are quickly put to the test when a prisoner, Moses, has an attack of the super crazies.
Clear! God damn it!
Moses' death reveals two things. First, the plucky young doctor is in fact the kid who saw West 13 years ago. And secondly, he still has the reagent. So you and me would have thought it'd be pretty risky to test a 13-year-old reagent on a corpse of an insane convict. But West says, nah, it'll be fine, and pushes the plunger. Of course, it isn't fine, and Moses reanimates and attacks the guards and Warden Brando before being subdued. Fucking nice one, West. Once the blood has settled, Howard tells West that he wants to work with him, rather than, avenging his sister's death. One of the series' highlights has always been the relationship between Herbert West and Dr. Dan Kane. Unfortunately for us though, Beyond gives us Dan in character, but not in name. He's called Howard instead. And the only mention of Dan is...
My last partner turned state's evidence against me. I'm expecting better things of you.
Not gonna lie, it's kind of disappointing to learn that Dan grassed West up to the feds. I mean, I thought they were going to be friends to the end.
I think we're ready, Dan. Good.
It also would have been interesting to know how much of the proverbial beans Dan actually spilt. Maybe Dan is in fact assisting the state with their own reagent experiments as part of his deal. So obviously it would have been ace to have Dan in the movie, and I think I'm not wrong in saying that this is probably most people's main issue with the movie. However, once you accept the realization that Dan isn't in the movie, Beyond Re-animator actually becomes pretty good. The more you're willing to leave Dan behind, the better this movie becomes. And I just like to think that Dan is off somewhere with Francesca, happily tasting her pasta sauce. So Howard is here obviously to replace Dan and perform a similar function in the story. And he's fine, I guess. His motivation is pretty odd though, because I'd have thought he'd be more inclined to kill West rather than help him. After all, it was one of West's creations that killed his sister. After West agrees to let Howard, help him with the experiments, we get something that's actually quite rare in horror movies, the montage, which basically shows West making a new batch of reagents, Laura investigating West's past and the Miskatonic massacre, as well as Howard and Laura getting more intimate. It wouldn't be a Re-animator movie without reanimating a poor animal, and this time it's a prisoner's pet rat. But this reanimation is different. We find that West's experiment at the start of the movie was to extract something called nanoplasm, which could be the key to successful reanimation. West injects the reanimated pet rat with the nanoplasm of a donor rat. The experiment seems to work. At last, West's reanimation is a success. It's a great moment in the movie, and you start to think that maybe all this carnage over the last few films has been worth it. Meanwhile, Laura begins to have suspicions about what happened to Moses and bribes the guard to get in solitary confinement. But before she can get any answers, she's caught by Warden Brando, who's then quickly attacked by Moses. Things get fucking dark quickly when Brando beats Moses. Now, there's always been a bit of a smutty element to the Re-animator movies, but I think this scene seems a bit too mean-spirited for the series. Back at the infirmary, the guards bring in a body. Yep, it's Laura. Howard is distraught, so West quickly hands him the reagent and Laura is reanimated in classic mindless zombie mode. Somebody get this girl some nanoplasm. Moses escapes from solitary back to his old cell where he's hungry for Cabrera's reanimated rat. A guard opens the cell to stop the fight and Cabrera uses the opportunity to liberate his fellow prisoners. The warden heads to the infirmary and finds West and Howard's secret lab, and West gives him what he deserves. Yeah, say what you want about West, but he doesn't fuck around when it comes to people trying to steal his work. West then uses the Warden's nanoplasm on Laura. The infusion is a complete success. For 30 seconds at least. The Warden's soul is now in Laura's body fighting for control. It's an amazing twist and takes the Reantics to the next level. After the visually striking but impractical experiments from Bride of Re-animator, it's great to see West finally back on track and advancing the reagent's true potential with the addition of nanoplasm. Nanoplasm exits the body on the moment of death and can even be extracted.
Did you know the human body loses 3 to 4 grams of weight at the moment of death?
And this is actually based on a real scientific hypothesis. It's referred to as the 21 grams experiment and is a scientific study published in 1907 to find out if the human soul had weight. The experiments were flawed and criticised, but it's an interesting read no less if you want to check it out. Anyway, the nanoplasm brings a whole new much needed element to the Reantics. Reagent brings you back from the dead and the nanoplasm gives you life. It's so cool to finally see West addressing the main issue with the reagent. And the fact that West got his idea for the nanoplasm whilst spending 3 years in solitary confinement is cooler still. I imagine he almost went insane in there before having the revelation.
Those 3 years in solitary were very instructive. I did my best work in there.
Yet in classic Re-animator fashion, there's a hitch. West believes that nanoplasm is an interchangeable energy source common to all living things, but it turns out that the energy is unique to each life, acting more like a soul and eventually taking over a host body. It's a really neat idea, and it prevents us from retreading old ground from the previous movies, while still allowing for plenty of shit to go wrong, which it inevitably does. The prison is now in full meltdown mode. West, Howard and Laura are separated in the panic. Laura is chased by Cabrera and some other prisoners and is eventually cornered. West, who could never really help himself, takes the opportunity to reanimate the Warden, and he tries another experiment with nanoplasm that belongs to a rat.
Behavioral imprinting.
The now reanimated Warden pulls a Dr. Hill and escapes, knocking West out and stealing the reagent in the process. He then wastes no time racking up another kill for the movie. A SWAT team arrives at the prison to try to control the violence. So not only are super reanimated dead running around, we've also got a whole blown fucking prison riot going on. Is this the wildest Reanimator ending or what? Back to Laura, and she awakens to find out that she's butchered Cabrera and the other inmates that cornered her. Warden Brando approaches and he's been busy. A reanimated Sergeant Moncho is under his control and they've been killing and reanimating inmates. Brando explains to Laura that the reagent can be used to indefinitely prolong an inmate's death. So, no matter the results of West's earlier experiments, we've always viewed the reagent itself in a somewhat positive light, something that has the potential to take the human race beyond death. But in a great twist, the Warden shows us a dark side to the reagent's use, an instrument of punishment and torture. Criminals now no longer pay for their crimes through death, which the Warden deems too brief and fleeting. They are now forced to exist within the moment of death indefinitely, trapped between two worlds of unending suffering. Sort of like watching The Rise of Skywalker on repeat. The sadistic Warden character is a bit of a cliche, but honestly I don't think there's been a more suited use for it than in Beyond Re-animator, providing the story with a definite antagonist, something that was lacking from Bride of Re-animator, as well as allowing the movie to further explore the morality issues surrounding the enigmatic reagent. Boobs are back. After the relatively breastless Bride of Re-animator, boob hounds will be happy when Nurse Vanessa is cornered by reanimated Moses. Damn, I felt that one. She flees towards the SWAT team who try to arrest Moses. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of gun kills in horror movies, but this one is so over the top that I'll give it a decent score. West and Howard reunite and follow the trail of reanimated dead to the Warden. West is attacked by Cabrera, leaving Howard to find Laura, whose body the Warden's soul has almost completely taken over. After dealing with Cabrera, West comes across Speedball, who's managed to find some reagent and injects a lethal overdose. Finally, we get to see the reagent's effect on a living person, and it's sort of like after I've had a curry. And fucking hell, is that the best eye-popping scene in horror or what? Let's check it out again in slow motion. Woo! West then reaches Dan and Laura and sees that the rat nanoplasm is rapidly taking over the Warden's body. Cabrera interrupts him again, and West is forced to finish them both. Meanwhile, Howard has been fighting Laura, who's been constantly transforming back and forth from Dr. Sexy to Mrs. Sadist. I mean, I can think of worse ways to die. Howard, who wanted to actually save Laura, is forced into pure survival mode, and we get the movie's final kill. West comes to the rescue in his own special way by nicking Howard's prison ID and pulling off a Shawshank Redemption. The undead Laura taunts a broken Howard, who is now just a hollow shell of a human being. West, meanwhile, gets off scot-free. What an absolutely fucking insane ending. Let's check out the final score for Beyond Re-animator. So we've got the most kills out of all the Re-animator movies, but gore-wise, Beyond is a pretty sneaky movie. It sure seems like there's a ton of the red stuff here, but actually, apart from Speedball's death, it's probably the tamest of the three movies. Despite the absence of Dan Kane, Beyond Re-animator brings back a lot of elements that were missing from Bride of Re-animator: a focused antagonist, a slickly paced plot, and more kills. Hell, even nipples are back on the menu. And despite having to introduce a whole new cast, the film manages to juggle time between them well enough, and overall it's nicely paced. It's not all nipple kisses though, and one of my main issues with Beyond Re-animator is the lack of West. In the first two movies it seems like he has a perfect amount of screen time, but here he almost gets lost in the mix. West as a character also suffers a little bit without Dan, and although Howard tries his best, we get none of the nuances that made West and Dan such a dynamic duo. The passage of time between the movies doesn't help things either, with Jeffrey Combs delivering an excellent but slightly more subdued performance as Herbert West. We see a rat fight a penis in the credits, which is as fucking gloriously nuts as it sounds. But generally the Re-animator dark comedy stylings take a bit of a back seat in this one, with no memorable one-liners. On the flip side, however, the movie doesn't go OTT on the CGI, something that would have caused a lot of people to genuinely hate it, me included. So how would you rate Beyond Re-animator compared to Bride of Re-animator? For me at least, I like Beyond pretty much the same as I like Bride. Bride of course has the Dan and West advantage, but Beyond is the punchier movie. But ultimately, Beyond Re-animator is much like West's Reagent itself. There's enough magic here to raise it from the dead, but it's lacking the nanoplasm to give it true life. So, Beyond Re-animator may be the last movie in this series, but West and the Reagent make another appearance in a little known 2017 film. So join me next time and we'll both check out 2017's Herbert West Re-animator, a movie that, if anything, will let me reuse this outfit again.